11. Mr. B again. The topic today is plants invade land. This is one of my favorite topics. I tend to do a lot of animal biology. Biology 11 is a very full course, but the plant biology, really great stuff. I want to get into it. What you're looking at on the course site, I chose this picture very specifically because when you look at moss, it's one of the very first plants that came up on land. In fact, we think, and the evidence suggests, that plants invaded land, plants kind of along the variety of the green algae. Now, if you think back when we were studying the protists and we did a little topic on algae there, we talked about phylum Chlorophyta, or the green algae. As plants came onto land, there was a really serious issue with them dehydrating. And in fact, you see a lot of seaweeds in low tide do a very interesting trick to keep themselves from drying out. They cover the body of the plant in a fine mucus, and it's very dangerous to walk around on rockweed or down onto some points in low tide because you can slip and fall, and then there's barnacles, all sorts of things you could hurt yourself on really badly. But the first land plants were sort of, well, I'm going to borrow a term from the frogs, a little bit amphibious, where they could be on land, but only if there was a lot of water present. If you think about this for a little while, one of the first things that should come to mind is something like what you see here, the moss. They tend to grow they're very, first of all, it's very short because they have no ability to transport water around themselves. They just act like a sponge to absorb water from where they're at. And when you think about where you find moss, you always find them around bogs and in really wet areas, bogs, swamps, the edges of lakes. They tend to do really well there. Sure, I find them out on my driveway, living in just about any nook or cranny they can, but to be really successful, they need that sort of almost amphibious life cycle, or amphibious in the sense that they need to be near water. Okay, so what have we got here for you? We've got some really good stuff. We'll do the first lesson here, which is the introduction to the non-vascular and vascular plants. And by vascular, I mean, does it have the ability to transport water throughout its tissues? Vascular, think veins, like in our bodies, vascularity. Okay, that'll help you. And there's wonderful materials we have on the site for you here. There's some really great interactivities here. And some of the critters that I want you to take a look at are ones you're not used to looking at, but we'll explain as we go along. The hornworts, the liverworts, then we'll work our way through mosses and then up to ferns. And that pretty well covers the simplest plants that have to be in sort of low light areas that really don't have a great ability to pump water throughout their tissues. Ferns, in fact, are the first ones to gain that ability, phylum Pterophyta. But I digress. We'll get going here. Okay, so first off, let's, I guess I better sign in. There we go. Get a little reflection going. Bam. Okay. So I like to call this Plants Invade Land. This is chapter 22.1, Introduction to Plants. There's a great number of things you could see in this photo that are intriguing to me. If you look on the stem of this decaying tree, it's all covered in moss. And moss are very good recyclers. And right nearby, we have the ferns, two very primitive plants, often found in very similar environments. So when it comes down to a plant, really what is it? What makes a plant not fit into the protist kingdom is that plants are always multicellular. They're like animals, they're hopelessly multicellular. They've got a true nucleus. Okay, so what that means, if you remember with plant cells, they've got we'll just draw it like this, they've got a cell wall like this, and then inside, a large central vacuole like this. They'll have their chloroplasts around the edge. And we'll talk more about the chloroplasts later. I'm not drawing it with color right now. And their nucleus, draw a big old spot here. I'll borrow one of these. Spot for the nucleus. I don't have enough space here to demonstrate all of this, but what really makes them stand out is that cell wall that they use to protect themselves. And it's made of cellulose, which is a strong carbohydrate we can't really digest. Termites, in fact, are one of the best critters on the planet for breaking down cellulose. However, we know it's not really the termites, but a symbiotic protist that's making all the enzyme for the termites. Anyhow, I digress. They're multicellular. Okay. And there's that whole cellulose cell wall matter. Now, we define them as being autotrophs. So I'm going to switch up this color because I'm getting bored of black already. They are autotrophic. And that means that they can make their own food. Auto. Think of this as automatically, or they can make their own. And troph, meaning food. Food/eat. That's sort of the way of thinking about it. The photosynthetic pigments that they tend to use, chlorophyll A is sort of the green one that when you look at a plant or you look at a typical leaf, it's that strong, powerful green. Whereas chlorophyll B, right, tends to be a little bit more. Let's see if I can bring up the color here. Chlorophyll B tends to be a little bit more yellowy. So I'll use the color marker to sort of have that stand out. Now there's other pigments. Chlorophyll A and B are like the big players in the game. Later on we'll talk about what colors in the spectrum, Roy G. Biv, that things like chlorophyll A and B go after. But if you ever look at leaves, especially in the fall, the plants reabsorb the chlorophyll. It's a very nutritive substance. They'll take it back in. In the fall, though, what you'll notice is that there are other colors in leaves, and we call those the accessory pigments. So the fucoxanthins, we can look at the carotenes. There's a whole variety of them. They'll come up as we go through this. Okay. Now, plant life cycles, they're getting into alternation and generation right away. It's important to understand that plants themselves, don't jump on me there. There's really two life cycles going on in a plant. There's just sort of like us, they have what's called the diploid generation, and they have the haploid generation. The equivalent in humans, this is the easiest way to explain this. We have two sets of chromosomes, one from our mother and one from our father. So, that makes us 2N for our chromosomes. Now, when we produce sex cells, we produce these little packages, egg and sperm, and when we do that, we have to get 1N from the mother and 1N from the father. And when those combine, you get a new critter, a new organism. It's a new combination because the egg and sperm are different. They have slightly different assortments of alleles and genes, but we won't get into that too far. And then once they come together with those new assortments, we get a new version of a critter. And we say that it is diploid. Diploid. Oops, work with me here. There we go, diploid. However, its sex cells are what we call haploid. Now, sometimes I like to say haploid, which is incorrect, but an interesting way of memorizing. We all do it from time to time. Haploid means you have half the chromosomal set of the full parent. And plants do this trick pretty well. We refer to the diploid organism, the 2N organism, as being the spore producer. And when the spores are being produced, we call that the sporophyte plant. Now, I'll go into a lot more detail on this in a minute. We make the sporophyte plant releases spores, and those spores are haploid. What will blow your mind about plants, especially these primitive ones, is that there can be another plant in the life cycle, one that you never saw, that does, well, basically has the sex. The spores will grow up into male and female plants, and these male and female plants produce the gametes. So if you look down here, you see that there's a boy plant and a girl plant, and they are producing egg and sperm. And only when those come together do we get fertilization at this point, and we get the other version of the plant, the one that makes the spores, called the sporophyte. Okay, we're going to get into that in a lot of detail in just a second, but for now, I'm just going to hit pause because I want to show you the kind of plants that we are going to look at. These are some primitive plants, and some of these critters you've never really taken a look at before. In fact, if we zoom in here, you'll see there's one version of the plant here, and there's another version of the moss plant here. So there's two life cycles. If you just collect a little bit of moss or pay attention to a bit out on your driveway or in your garden, eventually you'll see this come up. And you can see this one with this little capsule right here. It's literally growing up on another generation of the plant. So I'll tell you what these are. This down here is the gametophyte. And when the gametophytes had sex, this one grew up right here. This is called the sporophyte. It releases the spores that make the gametophyte. And then the gametophytes have sex and you get the spore producer again. All right. So, just a moment. Let's call this up. Okay. Now, what I wanted to show you was, in general, I think, let's see here. Nope. Ah, here it is. So, when we talk about very simple plants, one of the first ones we'll talk about are the bryophytes. And these little critters here, they have to stay in damp areas, and they can't really produce without water. In fact, their closest relatives, specifically the chlorophyte algae, release their egg and sperm into the water and fertilize directly in the water. These little guys, they're not like land plants that you know. They don't really have vascular tissue for transporting water or sugars throughout their structures. They're kind of simple, like sponges in a way. They don't have true leaves. The roots aren't really like the roots if we see advanced plants. So we've got a couple. When you look at the hornwort here, that's an interesting little critter there. If I can zoom in on that. There we go. And the flat plant is here, and then you see the next generation growing up sort of like a horn on top of it. This is like a warty structure down here. That's why they call it a hornwort. Over here, we have, I'll have to zoom out for you. We have what's called the liverwort, and it's kind of interesting. They call it that because it's got the warty structure. It sort of sits flat. It looks kind of like a liver. Interesting name. This is the one that you would be most familiar with, moss, and we have a good deal to talk about with these guys. But these are our most primitive, amongst the most primitive non-vascular plants. They can't transport water around their bodies, and as a consequence, they can't really get that tall. They have to hug moist areas. I'll hit back here. A neat little animation. There we go. The plants that you're used to seeing, that you would expect, you would be looking at conifers, things like this, which are more advanced to what we've come to expect of sort of our evergreen type plants. But there's more to this story. Our flowering plants, which are some of our youngest plants in the world, extremely successful because they reproduce with the help of insects and animals. And over here are pterophytes, which are our ferns. And these are very interesting because they have the ability to conduct water throughout their stem. And because they have true vascular piping, plumbing, they manage to get a little bit bigger. But if it wasn't for the bryophytes, our non-vascular plants, and then our early vascular plants here, we wouldn't have gotten to things like our conifers and to our angiosperms, our flowering plants here. So I'm going to let this go now. Okay, I've got some neat animations for you. They'll come up as need be. Liverworts, I think I gave you a good tour of that, so I'm going to get rid of these. There we go. All right. We'll go back into our notes just for a brief time. All right. Okay, so we're looking at this alternation of generation, that there's two versions of the plant that are required just for the whole fertilization process to happen. One version of the plant makes the spores, and those spores grow up into the sexual phase of the plant, the gametophyte. Phyte means basically means leaf. It's kind of interesting, but I always look at it and say, oh, the gametophyte plant. Oh, okay, that's easier to remember. This is a little bit of background information that you have the diploid and this haploid version of the plant. Remember that the gametophyte is producing the gametes. It's very interesting how that actually goes down. This version of the plant, it's already haploid. In ourselves, we'd have to go through meiosis. But this is an interesting circumstance where the plant is already haploid. So it just makes sex cells through just regular cellular division. And as it turns out, that's by mitosis. But more about that later. The diploid critter, the 2N1, produces the spores, and that's really just about regenerating the gametophyte. When the gametophyte has sex, we get N plus N. Well, that takes us back to the diploid sporophyte. So what is it that plants really need? Well, plants are photosynthesizers. They're autotrophs, by and large. So what do they really require? They basically need sunlight. So let's think about really what we're talking about here. If we look at photosynthesis, which I annotate with PS, you basically take a dash of water, you take carbon dioxide, and without balancing the formula, I'm just going to keep this pretty basic, you produce a carbohydrate. And that wonderful oxygen that plentifies our atmosphere. So water, carbon dioxide, you produce a carbohydrate, and oxygen. In order to make this happen, in order to drive this whole process, you need sunlight, obviously water, minerals help the process along. The gas exchange, really we're talking about CO2 here. One of this tool. Back here you. Gas exchange, CO2 in, oxygen out. But most importantly, when you're done, you need a way to transport this all the way from the photosynthetic organs. When you think about most plants, you think about their leaves, and the storage often happens down in the roots, although there are some interesting variations of that. Photosynthetic products can end up in fruit. They can end up in interesting modified leaves. If you look at an onion, and onions like that, there's a lot of carbohydrate storage in these thick sort of leaf-like structures. So the first land plants, we mentioned this right off the bat. They came from multicellular green algae, and if you think about your fish tank, you'll see an invasion of green algae all the time. Go to a dock, you'll find green algae growing off the dock. It's particularly fond of fresh water. So green algae was just dying to get up on land. In fact, we can't really keep it away, can we? It's everywhere. So you have to think about land plants plants invading land. They give it about a 450 million year time frame. And it's not that plants ever left the ocean, they're still there. It's just there was an opportunity or a niche for plants on land. And when you look at these really simple plants, they had to grow really close to the ground because they had to be careful of not desiccating or dehydrating. So it was just this sponge-like transfer of water. Capillary action. If you put water into, say, a paper towel, it doesn't have any uh, existing water transport mechanisms inside, but water will simply diffuse through the, well, spread out, diffuse, move through capillary action through the towel. So that's one way of getting water to pass up, just invades a dry area. But it was quite a concern for the early land plants because if they grew too great in height, water really wouldn't make it to the top of the plant. It would kill the plant. So when we go to organize the plant kingdom, it's a neat way to help us group plants. We can look at their water conducting tissues because the early tissue is either, let's put this in, there's either none. Let's see if I can get this straight a little bit better. There's either none, like with our mosses, or it's primitive, or we see advanced tissue. The next way of organizing is to say whether or not we see seeds. Now, the early plants weren't doing seeds. When you think about a seed, that's a little baby plant, a little embryo inside of a protective coat with some food. And later on, fruit even goes around that, which is what we see with the highly advanced plants, the angiosperms. But having seeds is a tremendous advancement versus just having spores. And if something has flowers, that puts it in one of the youngest categories on the planet because we don't see flowers. That's supposed to say none. Let's try that again. I was trying handwriting. Versus none. And all you have to do is go and look at your evergreen trees, your conifers, and you'll see that they don't flower. You look at your mosses and ferns, they don't flower. You look at the apple trees, I have two out in the front of my yard, they flower. And it's the flowering plants that produce fruit. That is very advanced. And when flowering plants came into existence, they provided things like bees and birds and even bats with a little incentive to come on in, a little bit of food. Okay, so plants are classified in a lot of ways. They can be also classified reproductively, how they establish their bodies, but there's some major facts here. So where did the land plants evolve? This is just a quick tour. Let's go with green. Here we go. Green algal ancestor. And we even saw our chlorophyte algae. And as they got closer and closer to land, we see that in this cladogram at least, water conducting tissue is something that ferns and conifers and angiosperms, they all have it in common. So we know that because the mosses don't have it, but these other things have it, we sort of know where to put it on our cladogram. Seeds are fairly young. Ferns don't do them, right? They just do spores. So we know that seeds are fairly youthful development in evolutionary schemes. And flowers, well, we only see those in basically our flowering plants. Our cone-bearing plants don't do this. So flowers, yeah, that's pretty young. And that provides a real competitive advantage for the flowering plants because they get the insects to help them with the reproductive life cycle, right? They don't just rely on the wind and the water, right? And that's a good strategy. Helps them to survive better. Okay, so this brings us to the end of section 22, part one. What was really important there was not just the basic ones that we introduced, the bryophytes, the mosses, the hornworts, and the liverworts, but we talked a little bit about that strategy of alternation of generation. You saw it in the protists, you're seeing it here again. Two versions of the life cycle that help to complete the overall reproductive strategy. Okay? So you've got a sporophyte and a gametophyte, and I stress that you really need to know that.